houses in which men have lived and died are haunted houses. Through the open door, the harmless phantoms on their errands glide, with feet that make no sound upon the floor. There are places where history lingers, where time slips if only for a moment, where echoes of the past whisper in darkened halls and forgotten corridors. Old buildings hold more than just bricks and mortar. They carry the weight of those who came before. Laughter, sorrow, love, loss. And sometimes, just sometimes, the veil lifts, revealing something beyond. From spectral figures glimpsed in candlelight, to stories carved into the very walls themselves, Haunted History Chronicles delves into the history, the hauntings, and the echoes of the past that refuse to fade. But the journey for the podcast doesn't stop there. We explore the strange and the supernatural, from folklore that has shaped beliefs for centuries, to unexplained encounters that defy reason. Tales of restless spirits, omens, cryptic legends, and mysteries that have endured through time. Join me as we unravel the haunted, the historical, and the hidden. So dim the lights, settle in, and step beyond the veil. You can follow Haunted History Chronicles on all major podcast platforms, as well as find us on social media to share in these stories. Because history, folklore, and the paranormal are never truly silent. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed. In this hauntingly insightful episode of Haunted History Chronicles, step beyond the veil and into the enigmatic world of spirit guides with historian and spiritual researcher Nick Richbell. Known for his meticulous and balanced exploration of spiritualism's shadowed past, Nick joins us to untangle the threads of belief, history, controversy, and identity surrounding spirit communication and those mysterious entities known as spirit guides. But who or what are spirit guides? What roles do they truly play in the world of spiritualism? And how have mediums through history claimed to communicate through them? From the early seances of the 19th century to the cultural explosion of spiritualist practices, Nick helps us decode the spiritualism movement's meteoric rise and the forces, both human and otherworldly, behind it. We'll uncover the stories of famed mediums and their guiding spirits, examine the explosive popularity of spiritualism in Victorian parlours, and dive into darker chapters, allegations of fraud, courtroom dramas, and the skeptical eye of people like Harry Houdini himself. Nick also brings a critical lens to the social dimensions of the movement. How did race and gender shape the way spirit guides were portrayed and experienced? Were these representations empowering or problematic? And how did the spiritualist press and its followers grapple with these questions? This episode is a deep dive into history, belief, and the unseen. Whether you're a skeptic or a seeker, Haunted History Chronicles invites you to step into the seance circle and decide for yourself. Are spirit guides echoes of the divine, clever illusions, or something else entirely? Hi Nick, thank you so much for coming back to chat with me on another podcast.
Hi Michelle, great to be here. It's a great way to spend an hour or so with you.
It's been a little while since you've been on the podcast. Do you want to just reintroduce yourself for the listeners and share a little bit about your background?
Absolutely. So Nick Richbell, I'm the head of Special Collections and Archives at Clemson University in South Carolina. And I have a PhD in history that I received in 2024. It's been a year now since I graduated from that program. And my area of research is the history of spiritualism, in particular Maurice Barbanell and his spirit guide, Silver Birch. So that was my dissertation. And I'm now in the process of finishing up turning the dissertation into a book that will be published hopefully by next June 2026. So I'm very excited to release that. I've got 2 new chapters in there that are different from the dissertation, and it'll be heavily illustrated, and it'll tell a really good story about Maurice Barbanell and his life.
So do you want to maybe just explain to, again, the listeners what spirit guides are and the role they play in spiritualism?
Absolutely. So in spiritualism, I kind of explain it that spirit guides would be a non-physical entity that help and guide an individual on their spiritual journey. And I kind of think of it and I explain it to friends is that, when I'm in the supermarket or if I'm walking down the street and I'm having that internal conversation with myself, I think that's me talking with a spirit guide. I may not be necessarily hearing from them, and I might be like umming and ahhing over which mayonnaise to pick, and then I might just feel guided to one section of the supermarket, and that's kind of in a very easy to explain way of what spirit guides do. And I think it's important to know that they guide and can help us with some advice and support, but they don't tell us what to do. Right? We still have free will. We still make decisions on our own, but they're simply as spirit guide. The name, they're there to guide us. Some people will have them as levels of protection, and they can shield an individual from negative energies or influences. If you're going into a seance, you may ask the spirit guides to provide, a white light of love and protection around the group to protect them from potentially anything negative that could come through. We could say they help with spiritual growth. They are believed to help in our personal and spiritual development, and they encourage us to grow and discover enlightenment, if you like. And then, of course, a big thing is communication. Spiritualism at its core is about receiving communication from the spirit world. And spirit guides can act as intermediaries between this world and the next. And they really facilitate that communication with other spirits or higher beings. And so that's the core of it. For my belief, is the communication piece. And I think it's important to note as well that someone may have a spirit guide today, but that spirit guide can change over years to another spirit guide as the individual, changes their life. You could go from being a student with a particular spirit guide, then once you graduate and you start working, you would have a new spirit guide who's helping you on this next stage of your life's journey.
So you mentioned the importance of spirit communication there. What are the kind of the common forms of spirit communications, and again, how does that relate to spirit guides?
Right. So mediums will depends on the medium, they will work in a particular way. So some mediums will hear words spoken from spirit guides. Other mediums may see pictures that are presented to them, so they then interpret to a message to someone they're reading. And I even know some mediums who see their messages from spirit guides in the spirit world as like a movie. They see this whole movie play in front of them, which they then kind of interpret and share with the person who the message for. Spirit communication can come in written form. You've got automatic writing. Medium will go into a soft trance with the pen in their hand and will write the words that spirit is channeling to them. There's a direct channeling. For example, Maurice Barbanell, he would, Silver Birch, his guide, would speak through him, and Maurice Barbanell's voice would change slightly, which to differentiate his voice from his spirit guide. Sometimes spirit guides will communicate to you in a dream. It's often people who lost a loved one, and then they have a dream about that loved one. And I always say, if that dream was full of love, then that was a visit from spirit. But if it was, an anxious dream or, it was upsetting, then that's not a true visitation. There's intuition in inner voice. Like I said, you're walking around the supermarket or waiting for the bus. You have that running dialogue in your head. That could be spirit communication. And other spirits will use signs. Everyone says if you see a white feather, that's a sign from a loved one. If you see a cardinal bird, that's a visit from a loved one. Symbols are interesting. And then lastly, this is not involved in spiritualism, but some people will use tarot cards and pendulums or runes to communicate with spirits. But like I said, that's not part of spiritualism. That's more of a new age aspect of spirit communication.
So, how do you think then spirit guides help mediums or individuals seeking communication? Are there distinctions between their roles, for example?
Yeah, so like I said, I think the biggest piece is they're facilitators. When I talked about Thomas Lacey with you all those months ago. Thomas Lacey has doorkeepers. His younger brother Walter died at a young age and came back, and Walter, the spirit guide, literally was like a bouncer at the nightclub. He would allow people in, and he would block people from coming in. So it's really that intermediary function, if you like, that the spirit guide can play there. Like I said, they will help with the protection piece. Often a medium will say maybe a small prayer. Like I said, surround me with white light of love and protection. They will help mediums by providing guidance on how to interpret a message or symbol. And they will also help with energy management. So they assist in managing the medium's energy, ensuring that that person doesn't become overwhelmed or drained during a seance or a session. Often a medium who's been leading a seance could be very tired and unable to maybe speak for a while after they come out of their trance. And then the distinction in roles. So mediums, they have spirit guides who are working with mediums who, like I said, really focus on facilitating this communication so that they can share messages with loved ones who have passed on and the people who are still living and want to hear from them. And then for the individuals, so for you and I in our everyday life, they're really focused on personal guidance, emotional support, and spiritual growth. And they'll communicate through the intuition and subtle signs, like I said, showing a white feather or the cardinal that flies by.
So, what would you say then the concept of spirit guides really does kind of reveal about spiritualism's worldview and the understanding of the afterlife? Then,
So I think firstly, there's an interconnectedness. Spiritualism emphasizes interconnectedness of all beings. And I think that suggests that the physical and spiritual realms are closely linked. Of course, it focuses, and highlights the continuity of life. As we know, spiritualism is really, spirit communication, and how, as we experience physical death, that's not the end of us. The soul goes on to a different plane of existence, if you like. And then, I think personal growth is important as well. Spiritualism focuses on personal and spiritual growth. And I believe that individuals can evolve and learn through their interactions with spirit guides. And then I guess with our understanding of the afterlife, spirit guides can help us understand that once we transition to this afterlife, there's several realms or planes, if you like, that spirit guides will live on, because you keep evolving even after you're no longer physically alive. So spirit guides work on the other side, and they can move on, such as Silver Birch, Maurice Barbanell's spirit guide. He made the conscious decision to return and work with Maurice Barbanell as opposed to move to the next plane in the afterlife.
so how have spirit guides then been historically understood and used within spiritualism?
So early spiritualism, and even into today, I would argue, spirit guides have been depicted as either specific historical or cultural figures, but often, and this is where the problematic aspect of spirit guides comes in, and we'll talk about in a bit, is that they've been portrayed as Native American people, or other racialized spirits from Africa or the Middle East or the Far East. So that's really kind of comes from the beginning of spiritualism, as I said, has trickled into today as well, or maybe a little bit less. And then, I think today, if we look at spiritualism today, we talk about angels. So angels may not, I would argue that they are not spirit guides and maybe weren't human form, but they're some other worldly figure, or otherworldly entity, if you like, that didn't necessarily exist on the earth as we do today.
So, do you mind sharing some notable examples then of some famous mediums and their spirit guides?
Of course, there's so many to mention, Michelle, but a few that immediately come to mind. Of course, Maurice Barbanell and Silver Birch. I know he was my dissertation, but I think they're the most famous that we would recognize. There's Eileen Garrett. She was a famous Irish medium that lived in New York, and she worked with an entity called Uvani. And I think Uvani wasn't necessarily a typical spirit guide. He was this otherworld entity that I just mentioned. She also worked with Abdul Latif, and Abdul Latif is seen across spiritualism as an ancient Persian healer who comes through in a healing personality. Helen Duncan, the very famous Scottish medium in the United Kingdom, she worked with a couple of guides, notably Albert and Peggy. And Albert was particularly foul-mouthed and a raucous kind of spirit guide. Estelle Roberts, she worked with Red Cloud, a Native American appearing spirit guide. Muriel Morris in the 1920s, 1930s, she had Power was the name of her spirit guide, another Native American personality. Then there's Leonora Piper, who had Dr. Finwy, who was a French doctor who liked to give medical advice. Florence Cook had Katie King. The list goes on, Michelle.
Are there any historical cases where spirit guides then have played a significant role in spiritual practices or events?
Yeah, I think let's go back to my friends Maurice Barbanell and Silver Birch. Silver Birch talked about service. This was key to Silver Birch's kind of teachings. Everything comes back to service and how you work to help and support each other. And he was selfless in his view of service as it being a means to spiritually advance both on this side of life and on the afterlife as well. Silver Birch also emphasizes the importance of spiritual growth and evolution. He taught that every soul is on a journey of continuous development and that our experiences on earth, both good and bad, contribute to the spiritual progress. For Silver Birch, suffering was not a bad thing, for example, which is quite interesting to read and think about because, as humans, suffering isn't good. Like, we don't feel good about suffering. But Silver Birch says sometimes you have to suffer to keep going on your spiritual path. And of course, life after death is really important with Silver Birch. He provided insights into the afterlife and obviously reassures people that death is not the end. You just transition to a different state of existence. And again, the spirit world is just this wonderful place of continued learning and growth. You don't pass on and stagnate. If you want, you can keep improving yourself and moving on to other realms.
So, why do you think mediumship, spirit guides, spiritualism rose in popularity the way that it did, especially in the 19th and the early 20th centuries?
Yeah, that's a great question, Michelle. So I think this is a well-studied aspect of, let's call it spiritualism, encompass all of these mediumship guides. It started because there were religious doubts. People started to question traditional religious beliefs. And people, those people were looking for alternative spiritual practices, and spiritualism offered them this diversion from, orthodox religion. And I think it's also rose in popularity in, especially the late 1800s, because it allowed women the possibility to move out of the home. You would see women speaking on, platforms such as Emma Harding Britten and Cora Hatt and the Fox sisters. So it really allowed women to earn their own money, if you like, and leave the home where they were traditionally kind of locked in, if you like. Of course, the wars is a well-studied aspect of spiritualism. People turn to spiritualism in times of grief and loss. So if you look at, say, the Civil War or the First World War, there were many, many thousands of people who died, and that led people to seek comfort and reassurance through communication with their spirit guides and spirits in order to keep that communication going with your deceased loved ones. And people are searching for meaning in these times of social upheaval and change. And spiritualism really offers that sense of purpose and understanding of life's mysteries. It became popular as well, of course, because of the prominent figures that we saw, such as the Fox sisters, Andrew Jackson Davis, and others who really brought spiritualism into the public eye, but through demonstrating mediumship and spirit communication. And then, literature and media. We could see books and newspaper articles about it. If we look at Maurice Barbanell's time, I've been studying the advertisements that appeared in the press as he did his propaganda tours around the United Kingdom. Pretty much on a daily basis, spiritualism was in the newspapers. So that, creates a popularity for people. And of course, scientific interest. Psychical research really took off in 1882 with the Society for Psychic Research as they formed, and they would conduct their investigations into the paranormal phenomena, which kind of lends a sense of legitimacy, I would say, and scientific curiosity to spiritualism.
And I think you touched upon something really important there in terms of just the way this manifested in things like in the media, in terms of print publications. This was something that was really being taken up and people were being exposed to. And I don't know if there's other examples that you can kind of point to that kind of help to illustrate just how popular this became in terms of how this was kind of being put out there to the public in terms of how they were consuming it, that really just helps to illustrate that growth, that surge in popularity.
Right. I think look at the spiritualist camps that were founded. We have Lilydale in New York State, in the United States, that was founded around 1879, and at the beginning was called the Cassadaga Lake Free Association. So that became a meeting place and a camp for spiritualists and free thinkers, they called themselves, to meet and discuss and have their meetings together. That became Lilydale Assembly in 1906. It's still going today, hugely popular their summer season, and they draw, many of the best names in mediumship of the day. There was another camp called Camp Chesterfield in Indiana that was founded in around 1891 by the Indiana Association of Spiritualists. There's another camp called Camp Silver Birch, and that was located in a town called Ephrata in Pennsylvania, founded in 1932 by the very well-known medium Ethel Post Parrish. And of course, Maurice Barbanell, he spoke at all of these camps in 1937 when he did a tour of North America. So that demonstrates the popularity of spiritualism by these three camps in not too far from one another. But Camp Chesterfield still runs to this day as well.
I think that points to just the sheer volume of people that were clearly interested in obviously attending, just the numbers, the rise in people taking an interest.
Absolutely, and the fact that it's still going today. I went to Lilydale for a couple of days back in 2019, right before COVID, and was astounded by the number of people that were there and the diversity of people that are interested in spiritualism, which I think helps. That speaks to its popularity as well, because spiritualism welcomes anyone. You could be a practicing Catholic or a Hindu, and you're still welcome to come and learn about spiritualism. You're not going to be asked to change your religion. You don't have to proclaim yourself as a spiritualist, but you're welcome to come and experience, mediumship and what spiritualism has to offer, and not give up any of your, current beliefs, if you like.
So you mentioned earlier, Nick, some of the controversies that surround mediumship and the use of spirit guides. Do you want to just maybe kind of help illustrate that a little bit further in terms of what some of those controversies surrounding this is, in terms of just going into that a little bit more detail to explain to the audience?
Absolutely. So I think the initial one that comes to mind is fraud. Um, you know, Spiritualism throughout its history, since the very beginning, has met accusations of fraud. Look at the Fox sisters, who are the founders of modern spiritualism. They were accused of fraud, and then they admitted to being fraudulent, and then they recanted their admission to being. It's a very complicated case. Um, and by fraud, we mean, the Fox sisters were accused they were cracking their bones to make the rapping sounds that were so famously reported to have started modern spiritualism. So I think that's the biggest controversy is the fraud, and that still runs to today, right? Because it's easy, I think, to deceive and trick people. Other people could be concerned that mediumship exploits vulnerable individuals. Like I mentioned earlier, you can be in your time of grief, and then you're so desperate to hear from a loved one who's died that you may not be, approaching the best medium who can help you or guide you through that sad period of time, because there are people who do take advantage of that. They're not genuine mediums, and they will can con you into giving money away. There's the scientific skepticism. The scientific community has been pretty skeptical of mediumship and spiritualism. Even today, the SBR will be skeptical about claims of mediumship, and that community, rightly so, demands empirical evidence for the phenomena. And that's one of the things I love about spiritualism, is that spiritualism welcomes these challenges from science, and spiritualists are happy to prove that their mediumship is real, and they're happy to be tested. Of course, there's ethical concerns that tie in with this exploitation as well that I just mentioned, because there's the potential for harm in spiritual practices. Another big controversy is cultural appropriation. The use of spirit guides, especially those from indigenous cultures, raises issues of cultural appropriation. And this is an area I do struggle with as well when I've been doing my research into spiritualism, because we can argue that spiritualists are culturally appropriating another culture, which they have no real understanding of in their real life, which I think is fair argument to make. And then, I think we can, we just talked about newspapers and media. I think the TV and cinema has done some damage to spiritualism, with scary movies and Ouija boards. And I think the portrayal of spiritualism in, kind of current media, is all about stereotypes and doesn't help spiritualism. I think it does do damage to it.
And you mentioned in some of those examples, obviously, the significance of fraud and how that's always kind of been there as part of one of the concerns around spiritualism and mediumship. And obviously, you mentioned the Fox sisters as an example of that. Are there other examples of notable cases where fraud was something that was alleged?
Absolutely. One of the biggest ones was Nina Crandon, known as Marjorie. So she was a Canadian-born, Boston-based medium. Her and her husband, Dr. Crandon, she was a famous medium, in the 1920s, and she was investigated by Harry Houdini, no less, who had a real vendetta against mediums, and he was trying to expose her as fraud. And that's not uncommon for magicians or conjurers to do this, because they would study a medium and then try and replicate what the medium had performed in terms of physical mediumship. In this case, with Marjorie, she was so heavily tested, and then she ended up, quite a sad death, I think, maybe through alcoholism or something. Like the Fox sisters, that was a sad story as well. A couple of those turned to alcohol as they were accused of fraud throughout their career. And then in the UK, I mentioned earlier, Helen Duncan is probably one of the most famous cases of a woman medium accused of fraud. She was convicted in 1944 under the Witchcraft Act of 1735. And people like Harry Price, a very famous psychical debunker, if you like, would accuse her of regurgitating cheesecloth that she claimed was ectoplasm during her seances. She was also accused of having two stomachs like a cow. It was, I think for her, it must have been a really hard life. She was strip searched and treated terribly. And then her last conviction did see that the Witchcraft Act was repealed, was replaced with another act called the Fraudulent Mediums Act in 1951. But sadly, she died shortly after coming out of prison. It was kind of a sad case for her.
And her court case is so fascinating because hundreds of people turned up in defense of her, which is astonishing, to have this play out in the middle of London in the height of the war, to have it spoken about in Parliament, to have Winston Churchill writing about it in his personal correspondence is just incredible. It's absolutely wild.
It is, and it's fascinating. And I know you've done some great research on this and blog posts and podcasts. So everyone should listen to that because it's truly a fascinating case of its time, especially as you said with Winston Churchill getting involved in it as well. It's quite like I said, a sad case. I don't believe she was wholly fraudulent. I think sometimes mediums in general may, play to the expectations of the person they're reading for. We talked about William Carthuser before, who sadly I think was a very genuine medium, but then, his greed and love of money took over, which led him to be a bit more fraudulent than, probably he ever intended to be at the beginning.
And, in the case of Helen Duncan, she was the sole income earner. So this was also the means for which she supported her children, her entire family. So there is also that pressure of, if nothing's happening, to almost perform and do something for an audience, because you have to have people coming back for you to be able to support your family. And so I think there's an awful lot of things that makes it quite a complex world. And I kind of tend to agree with you in the summation that you gave there. I think there are some things that clearly point to there are potential elements of fraud, but at the same time, there is so many questions still unanswered in terms of what Helen Duncan was kind of being seen to be doing and the knowledge that she had that suggests there's something else at play as well. So it's a fascinating case, and she's a fascinating woman. And I don't know if you know of any other kind of cases where alleged fraud has been examined in the legal courts in the way that kind of was with Helen Duncan here in the UK, if there's similar examples of that elsewhere.
I mean, the UK is kind of the hub for this, and of course, it has happened elsewhere. But in my research in Maurice Barbanell, he was involved in so many court cases, whether it was libel or accusations of fraud, particularly in the 1930s, when I think is when libel law changed, which made it possible to sue for libel. But he went up against Dr. Nandor Fodor, a very famous psychical investigator. He went up against the Zomars, who were a married couple that had this conjuring act of thought transference, and it just involved into this whole lengthy press battle and court case that he lost. He didn't often win his cases, but the fraud, sadly, does end up in the courts on many occasions.
Did you hear that? Sounds like the spirits are reminding you that you can support Haunted History Chronicles. If you love delving into the eerie and the unexplained, why not help keep the lanterns burning? Head over to Patreon, TeePublic or Ko-fi. All the links are waiting for you in the description notes and on our website. Get exclusive content, haunted merch, and more. Now let's step back into the shadows for more Haunted History Chronicles. And you mentioned a couple of people who have kind of been part of the debunking, if you like, of some mediums. Harry Houdini, for example, and and Harry Price in the case of Helen Duncan. Are there any other figures similar to Harry Houdini and Harry Price here that maybe were doing similar things? What were they kind of doing to kind of help investigate or debunk the mediums in the way that we saw during this time frame?
Yeah, so I mean, Houdini and Price really come to mind. They're the the big names in this investigations and trying to make fraud accusations stick. As I said, conjurers Harry Houdini would attend seances, incognito, in disguise, in order to later demonstrate how what he called were tricks, how the medium performed them. So with Mina Marjorie Crandon, his accusation towards her is that she had a bell in the room, in the seance room, that was in a box that would ring, and he claimed that she made that happen by using a ruler that would have been attached to her, that she could then, make that bell ring. He even went to Congress in about 1926, and he was a staunch advocate to get legislation enforced that would criminalize fortune telling, and people who were accused of fraudulent mediumship, to get them locked up in prison. His big thing is that these practices exploited grieving individuals. And then, of course, he wrote books and gave lectures, just like Price, right? Price was known for his rigorous scientific approach. How scientific it was, I don't know. I'd love to go back and look more into his archive to see, exactly what he was doing. But he, again, that was his life. His life was to try and expose mediums for fraud.
How have institutions like the Society for Psychical Research investigated mediums and their abilities and so on, and investigated that aspect of it?
Yeah, so the SPR, Society for Psychical Research, I know you just released a really interesting blog post about them, so people should go and read that. That this group, they were the first organization, as I said, in 1882, to formally organize themselves in order to conduct scholarly research into psychic phenomena. They aim to approach phenomena without prejudice. They were kind of open-minded, and I think they still are now, I'd like to say. But they wanted to use rigorous methods as have been applied in other scientific fields. They would do field investigations. So the researchers would go and investigate seances and haunted houses and other paranormal events. And they really wanted to eliminate non-paranormal explanations such as fakery, poor observation, or misperception. And then they would do controlled experiments. So that would be, for example, to test claims of telepathy or thought transference or other psychic abilities. And these experiments would involve strict protocols to ensure the validity of the results. And a notable investigation that the SPR conducted was of the Neapolitan medium Eusapia Palladino. She was known for physical manifestations during seances. And then while some people said that it was genuine, others exposed her as, being a trickster. And I think sometimes she herself would say she was tricking, but sometimes she was genuine. So she's a definitely interesting case for people to look into.
So why do you think then, just fraud, for example, why do you think that's become just as much a part of the story of spiritualism as the practices themselves?
So I think, part of it, again, as I said, spiritualism, they welcome the scientific aspect of this. They want to be investigated or tested so we can prove that it is real. And then, I think it's important, again, to look at the vulnerability of believers. There's the emotional needs of someone, as I said, who's grieving for someone. And then there's this strong desire for proof that does make it susceptible to believe in fraudulent practices. Then the historical context, there's the early exposure. This fraud has happened since the very beginning, as we've said, with the Fox sisters. And of course, there's a great public interest, fraud. Everyone, sadly, the human nature, sometimes we want to see people fail, especially if we're skeptical about spiritualism. we're going to be very interested in these high-profile cases, such as Palladino and Helen Duncan. And I think this investigations and fraud is such a part of the story because of the figures that are involved. Harry Houdini, this world-famous magician, who'd have thought that he would have become involved in investigating potential fraud in mediumship. So I think that's they're the key things that we need to look at. And again, the cultural influence and the media influence, as we talked about, how media has sensationalized fraud cases. And there's the paranormal shows on TV will sensationalize what these investigations and experiments can look like.
I think you raised some really interesting points there, because there is almost a little bit of celebrity to some of this, isn't there? There are some very big hitters, some people with real influence for whom, if they are endorsing a particular medium or trying to debunk a particular medium, then their voices get heard. And of course, it keeps it topical, it keeps it in the mainstream media. And I think media hasn't changed all that much in terms of, there is this real kind of effort sometimes to elevate someone, and all of this positive press to lift them up and then to drag them back down off that pedestal. And I think when you look at so many examples of mediums who have been kind of in the public eye and are quite well known, you see that very much in the way that they're portrayed in journalism. This rise where they're kind of endorsed and they're supported and they're celebrated and their stories put out there, and then suddenly this crash that you just see then the negative press and the negative articles coming through, which again I think just keeps the whole thing buzzing, doesn't it? It's the sensationalism aspect for both sides of that coin constantly playing out.
It does, sadly, and that's people attached to that, which I understand because it is fascinating. And I think just something important to note is that with spirit guides, in particular, it's empirically difficult to confirm a spirit guide is who they say they are, because spirit guides are individual to one person. It's not like if you go and have a reading and Grandma Jennifer comes through and it's her because she can give you specific memories and her personality. But a spirit guide, you can't prove one way or another that the spirit guide is who they say they are.
So earlier you mentioned obviously some of the controversy around race, and I think gender also comes into this as well. How do you think race and gender have influenced the perception and practice of mediumship and spirit guides?
I think these are very heavy influences. There's the historical context of the empowerment of women that I've mentioned. Spiritualism provided one of those few platforms where women could assume a leadership role in the late 19th century, and they could gain public influence. I've said it allowed them to earn money, and their voices were heard in public, which was very rare in other professions. And then, we had notable figures such as the Fox sisters, Emma Harding Britton, Leonora Piper. This changed traditional gender roles and contributed to the feminist movement. There's also the perception and skepticism aspect. Female mediums were sometimes pathologized, with their abilities being attributed to hysteria, for example, or other medical conditions. And so this really reflects a broader societal attitude towards women and their mental health. There was a gentleman called Frederick Marvin who wrote, he coined a phrase called mediomania, which basically said that women weren't mediums, they were just hysterical because of their physiological makeup, if you like. And then we take a look at Indigenous Americans. There's a portrayal of male Native American spirit guides who are powerful. They're Indian chiefs when they present themselves in seances. Whereas when the female spirits of Native American origin came through, they're often shown as being innocent and naturalistic. So there's this terrible stereotyping that has, been portrayed in spiritualism across the years.
And obviously, you just mentioned a really good example, I think, of racialized stereotypes in in some of the depictions of spirit guides. Are there other examples similar to that, in terms of how they're portrayed in spiritualist communities or in the press?
Absolutely. So, and I'll preempt this response by saying some of this language is not my language. This is from a book. This is what someone has written, and it's language of its time that I do not agree with. But there was a gentleman, 1940s, north of England, called Harry Emerson. So he has a book called Listen, My Son. Very hard to get, but if you can read it, it's fascinating. During the 1930s, Emerson befriended a British medium called Hunter Selkirk. And he attended seances that included the spirit guide called Zuru. He was Selkirk's chief guide and guardian, described as an old African Negro, a kind, gentle old soul whose very manner of speech is comforting. So this book, I would warn listeners, is full of, racist language and language we wouldn't use today. Because a frequent visitor to this Selkirk seance room was, and this is a quotation, Topsy, a little colored girl who is very witty and whose job was, and I quote again, to create harmony and good conditions for other visitors. Her voice was that of a gay, contented child, quite unlike the medium's voice. Then, imperial stereotypes begin to come in, as Topsy was described as having fully materialized during one of these seances, and her face was coal black, and later she's described as having white teeth that showed up very distinctly in contrast to her little black face. These are, it's shocking to read, but this is very common throughout spiritualism and spirit guides, in how the spirit guides are racialized and described such as that way.
How have organizations like the Spiritualist Press and Psychic News kind of addressed some of those issues that you were just raising?
So, Psychic News, I would say they address them head on. I would often question, why is Silver Birch, for example, portrayed as an Indigenous American? I think that comes down to just the portrayal of Native Americans as being, in harmony with nature and spiritual people. So the guide is shown to add credence to the messages that are being given, because you're more likely to believe someone who's being portrayed that way than if it was, say, an East End London Cockney barrel boy. But Psychic News, is full of discussions about spirit guides, and it's full of Native American guides that are talked about in the articles that were printed. And Maurice Barbanell was happy to take on these arguments and kind of defend this aspect of spiritualism.
Has there ever been a kind of an internal debate, a critique within the spiritualist community about these racial and gendered representations?
I don't think anything maybe formal as what we're doing today on my research, but I know discussions do happen. I've had discussions with spiritualists about these topics, and it's always a lively and spirited, pardon the pun, debate and discussion about these. But again, I think for spiritualism, it's more about the messages that are coming through than the spirit guide who's helping bring those messages through. I think often if you're in a development class to learn, mediumship and, expand your skills, the teachers who are mediums, they will avoid, discussions about spirit guides. They want to focus on the techniques and how to do the phenomena, as opposed to, who that spirit guide is, as I mentioned earlier, because it doesn't matter, because you can't prove either way that it is, an Indigenous American guide, or it is a Chinese guide, or it is a woman. That's not the important part. It's the message and how you get that message across that is the main focus of that.
And I think there's an element of, these questions, whilst they're uncomfortable for us as a modern audience, and rightfully so, we can challenge the stereotypes today, but they were of their time. And I think when we think of spirit communication and messages coming through, all the literature and the experiences point to they come through to that person, that sensitive person, in a way that's going to be something that's recognizable to them. And these were of the time, these were the perceptions and the ideas of the time. And whilst they may not reflect our ideas today, they may make us uncomfortable today, but there is an element of it was part of the history. It's part of the generational, aspect to it, and that changes. And I think it's just part of the story, if you like, in terms of the growth that's happened, and that will, I think, always be the case. In 100 years' time, similar conversations might be had about what's happening in today's society, and how these kind of representations of spirit guides come through to people. They may be critiqued in a slightly different way and look back on with similar kind of thoughts and kind of a critique of what's happening in today's society for the same reason.
Right. I absolutely agree with you, Michelle. And I think, we need to lean into this discomfort, have these discussions, not shy away from them. But let's talk about it. That's my kind of motto on these issues. Let's have a conversation, because we can't hide away from the history. We can talk about it.
I completely agree with you, and I think it's just part of the story. It's part of the history, and like you said, if we can talk about it, we can learn from it, we can grow from it, and we can understand it, and we can challenge it. And I think all of those are good things, rather than to not discuss it, to not debate it, is, I think, a disservice. I don't think that helps at all. So I think it's something that's really vitally important to look at and to think about and to consider.
Absolutely.
So, what drew you then to study and explore the topic of spirit guides and mediumship, Nick?
So I think I've always been kind of aware or interested or of the belief that this physical life cannot be all we have. Because if this is the case, it's pretty miserable, right? We look at the world, and especially the world today, it's challenging. And if, the day I die and that's it, it's sad. And I look back and I think I must have been about 4 years old, and I can picture it to this day. My mum, I was the youngest child. There was a brother after me who was stillborn. And I can very clearly remember being at my mum's hospital bed when this happened. But then, in later life, we had these conversations, and my mum told us, "No, you kids never came to visit me in hospital." And I think that was some kind of spiritual vision that I have of that time. And so I've always been fascinated by spiritualism and mediumship. But it was really when I started work at the University of Waterloo, and got to know some of their seance collections that we've talked about, the Jenny Pincock collection and the Thomas Lacey collection, that I really became fascinated in the people involved in spiritualism, and the phenomena that has been reported to be produced. And I just discovered that there's this whole world of spiritualism and archives and people like Maurice Barbanell and Helen Duncan. And I find it truly fascinating to continue researching this.
In what ways do you think modern spiritualism still, either rely on or reinterpret the concept then of spirit guides today?
So I think probably we can look at the definitions of spirit guides has broadened. If we look at today, I mentioned angels earlier. There's archangels. There's a medium, or I don't know if he calls himself a medium, but Kyle Gray in Scotland, he works with angels, and he's produced some really interesting books about that. Some people look to ascended masters as spirit guides, such as Buddha, Jesus. There's the vision of our higher self or future self that comes into these expanded definitions of spirit guides. Interdimensional beings, such as Uvani, who I mentioned, worked with Eileen Garrett. Maybe is a bit more new age than spiritualist, but it's, I think it's all part and parcel of that. And I think there's definitely a more eclectic and maybe we can say inclusive spiritual worldview these days.
What do you think the kind of that continued interest suggests then about our broader kind of beliefs and values still today then?
I think there's just more understanding and maybe more belief that life does continue after physical death. I think there's more interest in it. And we talked a bit about the negative television and kind of film coverage of this kind of area, but there's a positive side too. There's mediums that have their TV shows that look very good. There was one on TV that I was kind of, I'm not sure if I believe this, and I saw them in person in a in an auditorium giving readings, and it was fascinating. And I left that 100% believing her, which I didn't from the TV show. So I do think that more people are, well, maybe not more people, but people keep coming to spiritualist churches because they do have this belief that life does continue and they are able to communicate with loved ones.
And there seems to be, I mean, you mentioned obviously the broadening aspect of it, and there does seem to be a kind of a greater awareness and acceptance in kind of avenues that I would never have previously expected to see spiritualism being explored and touched upon. Or, I mean, I can think of the kind of the recent example of the series about Helen Duncan on BBC, for example. I mean, when would Helen Duncan and her story have ever been on the BBC? It I mean, it was kind of an unheard of topic for the BBC, but they've really kind of started looking into some of these and shows that put some of these information out there. UFOs, they've looked at kind of aspects of the paranormal, and there does seem to be this kind of almost like this movement, if you like, to start to kind of explore these in ways and areas that just I think previously we haven't seen. And I think maybe that reflects what you were mentioning about there's something very inclusive about this. And I think the more it broadens, the more people find their kind of little niche that really interests them, that allows them to explore some of these questions. And these are questions we all have. What happens to us? What happens after we are no more on this earth? What is the next stage? These are all things that we think about. And I think when we have so many different areas that allow us to touch on it, to think about it, reflect on it, find maybe a little pocket that interests us, it does kind of, as I say, I think it does reflect what you were saying about how I think it's becoming something more and more inclusive, which is fascinating.
It is, and I think on the tail end of that as well, spiritualism. You're not forced to believe everything. You believe what you want to believe. And I love there's a church in Canada that at the beginning of their service, they say, take what you can from today's service and just gently leave to one side that does not resonate with you. So it really is a very personal journey in spiritualism. And there isn't this blanket set of rules that you have to follow and that you're expected to believe. And just on the BBC, I haven't seen the Helen Duncan series, unfortunately, being in America. But I've heard about it, and I think that's fascinating. In Barbanell's time, the BBC was staunchly anti-spiritualism, and I would wonder what would Helen Duncan say today if she was alive and was like, now your life is on TV. I hope she would be amazed that she achieved more than being someone just accused of fraud.
Nick, it's always such a real pleasure to chat with you. For me, this is such a fascinating subject matter, and it's one that never stops giving because, when you start to look into mediums and their spirit guides or spiritualism, you start to uncover these stories that maybe are lesser known and these accounts of people who are lesser known. And I mean, some of the information out there is just so intriguing and so fascinating. So it's great to kind of peel back the curtain a little with you and to kind of explore the topic with you, given that it's something that you're so passionate about. And yeah, I hope we get to do this again because I think there are many, many more different curtains that we can peel back and take a look at the topic again from different angles. And yeah, it's just such a forthcoming subject matter, I think, that's fascinating for me. So
It
thank
is.
you so much for your time.
Oh, I love it, Michelle, and thanks for having me. And like you said, we're just kind of breaking the surface here with what we've talked about. There's so many layers beneath it, and I hope people listen to this, find something interesting, and go off and research, or ask questions and find out more.
And obviously, I will make sure to include details to follow you and everything on the podcast description notes and on the website, so that obviously we can still keep abreast of what you're doing. So when things like the book come out, people will be able to obviously know what's happening and when it's happening. And yeah, I can't wait to see what comes in the future from what you do, because I'm very much looking forward to this book. It's definitely going to be on my list of things to read the minute it comes out. So I can't wait for that one.
Appreciate it.
And I'll say goodbye to everybody listening. Bye, everybody. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the unknown. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe, rate, and leave a review on your favourite podcast platform. You can follow us on social media for updates and more intriguing stories. Until next time, keep your eyes open and your mind curious.